Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of 10 Minutes with JPIDS. I'm your editor-in-chief, Ravi Jhaveri, and we're really excited to be joined by Andrew Dwyer from the American Board of Pediatrics. He's going to be discussing one of the papers we recently published about overhauling the content outline for the Pediatric ID board exam. So welcome, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Again, thanks again for publishing with JPIDS. And our listeners know that I start every interview with the same question, which is I'm a superhero nerd, and every superhero has their origin story. So I know you're not a PEDS ID person, but we'd still love to hear how you landed in your current role at the ABP.
Yeah, yeah, thanks. So as you said, I'm not a pediatric infectious diseases subspecialist. I'm not a physician. I'm not a pediatrician. I have my PhD in educational psychology, and I started working for the American Board of Pediatrics about 10 years ago. And one of the big parts of my job is facilitating projects like the one that we published. And I guess so my background is actually in like educational psychology, like I said, but more specifically psychometrics, which is someone who is an expert in measurement or assessment, or testing is another way of saying it. So my parents don't even really know exactly what psychometrics is. I think if you ask them, it would be vastly different than how I would describe it. But yeah, it's somebody with expertise in the testing process. And so one of my jobs at the ABP is to facilitate the development or the identification of what knowledge areas are covered on the exam, and that was the process that we went through with for PEDS ID.
Awesome. Um, so maybe we can just start with sort of when and how it became clear to both the ABP and the ID subboard that you guys were going to need to do this update.
Yeah, so it's actually not really the case that we monitor and have criteria that would um, determine or that would make us need to update the specific content outline in a particular discipline. We actually just do this as regular ongoing standard work. We offer certification exams in general pediatrics and in 15 pediatric subspecialties. And what we currently do is we try to update the outlines once every 6 years for each of these certification areas, which means that at any given point in time, we're doing about two or three of these.
Hmm.
And it just was on the schedule, on the timeline for us to do this in the last year for pediatric infectious diseases.
Okay. Okay. And so maybe could you walk us through sort of the process with how you guys
Yeah.
did this? I know you covered it in the paper, but maybe just about forming the team of individuals that help you with the process and then getting started with the actual update.
Yeah, yeah. So this is described in the paper, but kind of at a high level, what the process looks like is we typically recruit a panel of practicing subspecialists in whatever discipline, in this case, PEDS ID, and we ask them to kind of give us an updated list. We develop, as a group, just over a series of meetings, a list of the tasks that PEDS ID subspecialists perform in practice. And then my job is sort of to facilitate a conversation where the main question is, what are the knowledge and skills that someone would need to be able to perform those tasks safely and effectively? And throughout those conversations, we kind of identify the list of knowledge areas that are required for safe and effective practice. And then we organize those knowledge areas into domains and subdomains and what eventually becomes the content outline. We do often use the previous version of the content outline as a starting point, and we just make revisions to that. So over the course of several months, we'll meet on a regular basis and just go through the previous content outline, make revisions to it. And then once we're comfortable with the draft content outline, a big part of the process is to send out a survey and invite everybody who's board certified in that field to review the new draft content outline and provide feedback. Did we miss anything important? Are there things that we listed that really ought not to be on the exam, not to be covered on the exam? And so that survey is really validating often, but it also does provide some information that we use to make some further revisions and updates. And then at the end of that process, we'll pass off the draft outline and the survey results to the PEDS ID subboard, which is sort of like the oversight committee that
Hmm.
we have at the ABP for pediatric infectious diseases, and they give the final approval of that document, and then we publish it on the website. So we actually published the new version of the outline last year, about a year ago this time, and the most recent administration of the initial certification exam was just a few weeks ago in November. And so that was the first version of the exam that was built to this newly published outline.
Cool. All right. We'll just pause for a moment to welcome Gordon Schutze. Gordon's at Texas Children's Hospital. Gordon, thanks for joining us. Um, all right. So we were just sort of middle of the way through our questions. We were talking about the process and starting the process. So maybe before I go to the next question, Gordon, I do want to go back to your origin story. If you could tell us how you got involved in PEDS ID, whenever that
Sure.
was. You don't have to tell us when.
No, sure. I have to be happy to. Let me just first apologize. I got a new computer, so took me like 10 minutes to log
Yeah,
on.
no worries.
Um, so when I started my residency in pediatrics, I knew exactly what I was going to do, 100% sure. I was going to do primary care, and I was going to South Texas to work. So about February of my internship with my 1,000th RSV admission, I said, I tell you what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to do primary care. I'm not going to South Texas to work. Then I had to figure out what to do. And so this was in the 80s when scopes were just coming out and they were very cool and I liked everything. Um, and I just done an ID elective and just, the teaching I got was awesome. I thought the physical exam skills were awesome. But, you know, microbiology was my next to worst grade in medical school. So I didn't really think I was smart enough to do that. But to make a long story short, I turned things around and said, well, what don't I like about a lot of these things and how much would I do? And like, GI was chronic recurrent abdominal pain and I didn't want to do that. But ID, it was fever. And I thought fever was cool because you'll find something every once in a while. So that's what got me to sign up for ID and probably the best decision I ever made.
Okay, so you got the fever literally,
Yep.
and you chose ID. All right, awesome. All right, well, thanks for sharing that. All right, so we're going to go back to the question. So, um, Andrew, I'll ask you this first, and then maybe Gordon ask you to comment. So, can you, based on compared to the other pediatric specialties, was ID or is ID unique in the way you had to put the content specs together? Did you have to do anything differently, or pretty much the process was the process, and there wasn't actually a lot of extra stuff you had to do?
So it's a great question. I would say, generally speaking, the process is the process. And what we did for PEDS ID was very similar to how the process unfolds for the other pediatric subspecialties. And once we had the content outline, it's fairly similar in nature to the other content outlines in other disciplines. What is unique to PEDS ID, though, and Gordon can speak to some of this because he was on the subboard for many years and was one of the individuals who wrote questions for us. And so this is feedback that I received often from the subboard members and the item writers, which is that PEDS ID changes at a more rapid rate than some of the other pediatric subspecialties. And so where that impacts the work that we do at the AVP when we're developing the exams is that it's not so much that the higher level content categories change so quickly. Like there's always going to be a category that is antimicrobial principles. It's
Hmm.
just the guidelines within those that the questions are written to change at a regular or at a more rapid rate. And so keeping the item pool up to date and revising questions that go out of date is like a bigger job
Huh,
in PEDS ID than it is for some of the other pediatric disciplines.
interesting. Gordon, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think the only other thing we talked about, Andy, a little bit that I think makes us different is we're mainly a consultation service.
Hmm.
So we're not a primary care service. We don't really have our own patients to start with like most other subspecialties do. So that was taken into account too while we were doing this.
Okay. Um, and then sort of on a related uh, uh, topic, can you maybe comment on, and this is probably uh, somewhat related to other specialties and then somewhat unique. Can you comment a little bit on some of the generational differences that have happened over the years and how you've had to perhaps adjust the content outline based on that. And I'm not trying to generational bash, I'm just asking honest questions here because people think and learn differently now than they used to before. That's my intent. And then the second is, as we've seen sort of resurgence or return of vaccine preventable infections, have you had to recycle content that you previously thought that you could retire and maybe had to re-expand and refocus on some visual, uh, classic rash type content?
Mhm. Well, so the first question I think is actually maybe even a little more insightful than you may know, which is that um, I think traditionally the role of the ABP has been solely to determine whether somebody has or does not have the knowledge needed for certification or for safe and effective practice. And so we identify the knowledge that is needed and we test to determine whether people have that knowledge. But how people get that knowledge is not really our role or our responsibility. That's up to the training programs and the community at large to make sure that people to address like learning differences and style differences in how people acquire that knowledge. I would say that's shifting just a little bit, and we're starting to sort of think about how do we help people stay up to date once they've become certified?
Yeah.
How do we incorporate some of our assessment principles into the training space? So some of that work is happening. There is like this shift, but largely speaking, this process is still not um, recognizing differences in how people learn or how, where and how people practice and where they get their knowledge. So it's a good question, but I would say we're just starting now to get into the like kind of to a place where we're partnering and collaborating with training programs on a little different way than we used to.
Okay. And maybe before you move on to the part about the vaccine preventable stuff. So,
Mhm.
uh, Andy, are you also involved then in some of the maintenance of certification, sort of testing and stuff? And obviously, then that relates to the point you just made.
Yes, exactly. That is kind of what I was thinking about when I was answering that question is that one of the main areas where our thinking and our role has shifted is in the maintenance of certification space, specifically the development of MOCA PEDS,
Yeah.
because that is where we've started not only using that assessment to determine who's staying up to date, but there's elements that are helping people stay up to date. And, there's a rationale that explains the right answer and why the
Yeah.
wrong answers and references and all that stuff. So that's a good example of how we're shifting from purely a summative pass-fail decision-making organization to sort of like somebody who's, at least we're hoping to help people actually stay current in their jobs.
Yeah. And then the second part of the question, sort of the resurgence, maybe Gordon, do you want to cover that? Like, how did you guys think about the content outline and
Yeah,
refocusing on some content that we used to think was historical and now is becoming more current?
well, you're talking about almost 3 years ago, so we really weren't in the space we are now. I don't think we would do anything different, probably. Um, but it's hard to say. I mean, I don't think we focused on something in anticipation. Measles of it coming back. Measles was already there, always
Yeah.
there, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think it's anything changed to date. One of the hardest things for me, I think, was um, when we were thinking about these testing situations, is that um, we're trying to define the bottom, right? What is not who's at the top, but what's at the
Hmm.
bottom, and how do we know what's our definition of competent based upon these test questions? That's really was hard, I think, for people to really understand.
Okay.
I noticed, so I went back and looked at the previous version of the content online and this newest version, and there weren't a lot of things in the new version of the outline that specifically address this, but there was one line in there that talks about vaccine hesitancy and
Okay.
the new role that PEDS ID, but also other pediatricians are now having to take on, which is deal with an increasing number of parents and people in society that are just vaccine hesitant.
Yeah.
Let me add this too. When COVID, I was writing questions for the board during COVID, and the board was relatively agile during that time, and we developed some questions very quickly for MOCA on
Mhm.
COVID.
Yeah.
And so they have the ability to do that. If they see something coming out, they can adjust pretty rapidly and get stuff out there for the Mocha test takers.
Yeah. Okay, maybe just the last question, and I think Andy, you covered this a little bit, but what is the plan then for monitoring and kind of iterating the outline going forward?
Yeah, so the plan is to just continue to do these kinds of projects on a regular schedule, which is about every 6 years. So we did it last year. That would mean in about 5 years, we'll start the process again and hopefully have a new content outline in 5 or 6 years.
Okay. Gordon, anything to add there?
No, I just want to thank Andy. I mean, he drove all this pretty hard and did a great job. And you know, he drove us getting this paper out as well, which I think is important for the PDID community to really understand what goes on. You know, we hear a lot of grousing about, well, why am I testing on bacterial vaginosis? I don't see that, and all this other kind of stuff. And so, trying to make it as transparent as possible about the process. It's a long process
Yeah.
that's gone through to get this established.
Yeah, 100%. We agree. Obviously, that's why we were so interested in publishing the paper.
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
you're preaching to the choir there. But all right, well, I want to thank you so much, both of you, for joining us today and for talking about the work. So thank you. And then I want to thank all the listeners, and we'll see you next time on 10 Minutes with JPIDS.